So we talked about regular composting last week, and that's this kind of bin or a big open bin where you stick your food waste along with some brown material and you wait a while and you let it compost. Today, we're going to talk about composting with Steve the worm. Why would you want to use worms in your composting? Well, the great thing about worms is if they are in your compost, they can produce compost faster, and it has an even greater nutritional value than the compost you're creating in a bin. We talked about how expensive it is to go back to the store and buy compost from a company. Well, if you look at the value of worm compost, it sells for even more money because of the extra nutritional value that worms provide in a bin. So let's check out my worm bin with Steve the worm and see what his home looks like. Are you ready to meet Steve the worm? This is my worm house that I purchased online. A worm bin doesn't have to be this fancy, but this is what I use. It's a multi-tiered system, and in here we have thousands of Steves at work on my compost. Come a little closer and we'll take a look. Did you know that there are more than 3,500 different types of worms? Yeah, that's incredible. Some of them are huge. However, this type of worm, Steve, is a red wiggler. And if we look in here under the soil, we're gonna see Steve at work. Oh, look, there's a bunch of Steves down in here. They're in here taking all of my food waste and turning it into really healthy soil. They're doing a lot of work right here that isn't happening in my traditional worm bin. We talked about the fact that this compost is going to have more nutritional value than your traditional compost. What else is it doing? Well, it's keeping more stuff out of our landfills. This is our food waste, and it's being turned into nutrition that will go back into the garden. And anything that I have from my kitchen that I don't put in here, I again check to see if I can put in my yard waste bin to make sure that it's still getting utilized. Steve is a little bit particular about what he eats, so I'm very careful about what I put in this bin. So each of these Steves can eat half of their weight a day in food. So it's really important that we feed him the kind of food that he likes and also don't overfeed him or he's going to be very unhappy. So we can come and see what kind of things Steve is eating right now. Steve really likes eggshells. They take a while to break down, but they have great content. He loves the fact that they're crunchy. Right now, he's also eating, it looks like, some celery. Just like a regular compost bin, you need to make sure it has plenty of matter like paper. So this is a paper towel. He loves lettuce and spinach and kale. He does not like any citrus foods. He doesn't like onions. Any of you guys out there the same way, no onions? You also want to make sure you don't put anything that has a chemical in here and nothing with salt. So if you have leftover vegetables that you cooked, you added some salt to it, you don't want to put that in Steve's bin. You want to put that in yard waste. Salt makes him very unhappy. Now, the most important thing is to make sure that Steve is happy. You want his soil to be moist, but you don't want it to be soaking wet. You don't need a fancy bin like this in order to create a worm garden if you want to start one. You really just need a basic Rubbermaid container. It can be any old bin that has a lid. You want to make sure that you drill some holes in it because Steve absolutely needs oxygen. And then you fill it with soil. You can fill it with things like newspaper, some material from your garden, your basic leaves and that kind of thing. And then after that, you want to make sure you put a little bit of food in it and then you add your worms. Now, where in the world do you get Steves? Well, I got Steves, believe it or not, at Uncle Jim's Red Wiggler Farm online. Sometimes you can also find them locally, and I started out with just a pound and one layer. As you can see, I have a multi-tiered system that's a little fancier than a Rubbermaid bin. So each one of my layers is in a different state, and each one of my layers has Steves doing the work. They get to choose. They can go up and down between the layers. They get to decide where they hang out. You can see sometimes, like, I have some slugs in here, so you start to get other critters, and they're not harmful. They're also doing the same decomposition process. So I let them stay in there. You can see how many Steves are under here of different sizes. I let them stay in here. Anything that's not harmful to the bin gets to stay, as long as they're not doing any damage. So if you've decided to create your bin and you've gathered the materials, including your waste and your Steves, you drill your holes. You want to make sure you cover those holes if possible with a screen material. Sometimes Steve actually tries to get out. The very last thing that you need to do before you start your bin is decide if you want to name them. As I said, all my worms are called Steve because I can't tell them apart, but you can choose a name for your worms. We talked about what Steve likes to eat, but how often do you feed him? I feed my Steves once a week. I have a collection bin. It's the same one I use for the compost that I keep in my kitchen, and I put in coffee grounds and some newspaper and then some green material like our leftover lettuce that we didn't eat and spinach and kale and that kind of thing, sometimes some carrots. And then once a week I come and I add that to the bin. It's really important that you keep adding paper after you started your bin. You don't want to just keep adding food. Now the funny thing about Steve is you're going to know if he's unhappy. He's going to tell you. Well, how in the world does a worm tell you if he's not happy? You listen very, very, very carefully and you see if he says anything. Nope, he's pretty quiet. Well, in this case, I think he's happy, but that's not how you tell if your worms are happy. What you actually do is you look down. And if worms are not happy, they will try to leave. Yep, they run for the hills. If you were to look into your bin, let's say it's a big Rubbermaid bin, and Steve is up the side where there's no food and no soil, he does not like his environment, and he's trying to get out to find a place that makes him happy. That means you've either given it too much food or you fed him something that he didn't like. And it will smell bad usually, and it might start to have some bugs in there that aren't the kind of bugs you want in your bin. That means something about your environment is wrong, and you want to make sure you make it right because you do not want Steve to be unhappy. What's that? Some people are really brave and they put their Steve home inside the house. I love Steve very much. You can see I've made a sign for him. I've given him a beautiful home. He even has a hotel cover. However, I didn't want Steve in my house. So Steve stays outside. He actually stays outside all year. When it gets cold in the winter, I take him and I put him up against the house because it's a little bit warmer there. One time, the first time I had a garden in the winter, had him outside and it got really cold. The entire bin was frozen and I was really worried that Steve was not okay. I took him into the garage to warm him up, and then once he defrosted and it unfroze, Steve was actually still okay. Now, in that period of time where he was not living in his best environment, he wasn't doing any work for me, which I completely understand. I also apologize to him for letting him get too cold, but they're actually pretty tolerant about being outside. They don't like it really hot and they don't like it really cold. But so far, I haven't had any problem with Steve dying from the temperatures. So I keep him outside. And I make sure that if the soil for some reason looks really dry in the summer because it got hot, that I add water. However, for the most part, with all the decomposition that happens, I don't ever have to add water to my bin. You really don't want, I have a tray in the bottom that collects the extra water, but you really don't want a bin that's so wet it's coming out the bottom. That's why we have a little cover for Steve. So when it rains, it's not adding a lot of moisture to the bin, because then the worms become really unhappy and try to leave. Here's a few facts about Steve the Red Wiggler. A worm is an amazing creature in that they can actually regenerate most of their body parts if they are separated. So they'll just, if you cut him in half right here, then you have 2 worms, and most of the time he's going to be fine. Do you know that there are more than 1 million Steves in 1 acre of land? Now, what I find amazing is that some poor person had to go out and try to figure that out. He actually hatches from a cocoon, and sometimes when you turn the worm bin over, you'll actually see tiny little circular cocoons, and that's more Steves. So I started out with 1 pound of red wigglers, and if you come look closely right here, you can tell just in this one undisturbed layer how many Steves I now have. That means he's happy and he's doing the work and is happy with his environment. So what a worm does that's interesting for composting is they actually love to be deep down. Steve really likes to tunnel, and he gets in there and he mixes all these layers up together, which creates a better composting environment. And finally, the big thing you want to remember is Steve doesn't like to be dry. So if you ever look in your worm bin and you see that none of this soil is dry, you want to make sure that you add some water. So now what do you do with your bin once he's composted? Well, right now, none of my layers appear to be ready to actually harvest. As you can see, this one still has a lot of newspaper. This one right here is close. If you dig down just a little bit, you'll see that this right here is beautiful, very highly nutritious soil. So there's a few things on top that still need to be consumed by Steve, but for the most part, he's doing a really good job with this layer. So what I do when I'm ready to harvest is I actually take it and I open it up, I take the top off and make sure that Steve is getting a lot of sun. We know he likes to tunnel, so if I open it up and I loosen the layers, Steve is gonna go down to one of the other layers because I don't wanna harvest Steve, I wanna leave him in his home. Then what I do is I try to make sure all the worms are out of that layer of the bin, and then I actually just get a bucket with a sieve on top and I try to shake out so that if any of this material is not quite ready yet to go into the garden as compost, that I remove it and put it back in one of the other layers. I empty it out and then I start the process all over again. Welcome back to Hagrid's Gardening Channel. You'll remember last episode, we talked about composting. If you did that experiment, it's time to get it out and check and see how things are going. If not, go ahead and take a look at our first video and check out the experiment about composting. Thorn, what do you think is happening right now with our composting experiment?
The paper is mainly starting to get wet and dissolve.
Paper starting to dissolve? Are the layers getting any different?
They're slightly like shrinking into each other. They're kind of blending.
Shrinking into each other. So what we did here is we went ahead and marked what's happening with our layers so we can see the difference. And then what you want to do is you want to get out your journal and make sure to take notes on what's happening with your compost.
3, 2, 1.
All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to do an experiment. You remember we did the compost experiment last time. We're going to create another one of these for our worms to see how it changes the composting process. So if you're ready, all you need is another empty bottle with the lid cut off, some newspaper, some soil, some food waste, a little water, and most importantly, one worm. Now, one can't go to the internet and order a single Steve. So what do you do for worms? Well, most of you should have access to some sort of garden. Go ahead, dig a little and see if you can find a worm and invite him to come and live in our new worm home. Once we're all done, we're gonna put him back after our experiment to make sure he gets back out to the garden so he can get to work. All right, so Thorn, we have the top cut off. What we're gonna do is we're gonna start with just a little bit of soil in the bottom. Put a little bit of soil in the bottom of the bottle.
Where's the soil?
Over there in that bit. Okay, so we have some soil for Steve. We also know that Steve likes to have a little bit of newspaper. Put a little bit more in and then a little bit more soil. Now while he's doing that, I'm very carefully going to actually take out a few little holes from this bottle because what we want to make sure that Steve gets is air. That's right, Thorn. Why do you think Steve needs air?
And also, he can't breathe and he'll die.
Yeah, that's right. Steve will die without air. So we want to make sure that he gets plenty of air. What else do worms like? Do they like it to be bright or do they like it to be dark?
Darker.
They like it to be darker. So at the end, you can either wrap your bottle with something like newspaper or you can put a bag over it, making sure he's still getting oxygen, but covering up so that he can do his work. So now that we have this here, we want to add a little bit of our food waste just on top. So right now, Thorn is just adding a little bit of kale to the top. You can add a little piece of apple or anything on the approved list to the top of his bin. We don't want too much, so that's probably plenty because we only want to put one worm in here. We want to make sure he has food. So again, we have one Steve. Everyone say hi, Steve. You can say hi, Steve. All right, we're gonna put Steve in the top. All right, if it's looking a little dry, you might want to add a little bit of water. You got to remember that as food breaks down, it will actually create its own moisture. We're going to then put the top back on Steve. Again, we're going to make sure when we do this, though, can you hold that there, Thorn?
No, you.
Okay, we're going to make sure that we don't cover his air holes up. So Thorn went ahead and taped the top on. You can see that he's left a little air hole. I'm going to add just tiny, I'm a messy, aren't I? Tiny bit of water, not too much to make sure he has a little bit of moisture. And then what we're gonna do is wrap a little bit of paper around the outside. Again, not covering his hole up. And you could even put this in a bag to make sure he's happy. But again, Steve wants it dark, so make sure you try to find a way to make it dark for him. Now, you put a little piece of tape on it if you want to, or just find a way to wrap it. Again, you want to encourage Steve not to leave. Otherwise, you'll find him somewhere in your kitchen. So just one piece of tape down here to keep all the newspaper on him. All right. What you want to do is every couple of days, you want to peel the paper back a little bit. Just make sure that everything is looking okay with Steve. And as always, we want to make sure we're taking notes in our journal. So for today, I wrote down that we created Steve's home and that we fed him. In a couple of days, we're going to take notes and see what Steve looks like and see if he's happy. What do you think, Thorn? What do you think Steve is going to be doing in a couple days when we check in on him?
Eating the dirt and eating the like paper and stuff.
He thinks he's going to be eating the dirt and eating the paper. Do you think it's going to be like this, where everything is still in a line, or do you think there's going to be more?
There'll be more mixtures because where he moves up and down, there might be some trails.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to compare our two experiments and see what the worms do in the composting process. We're going to leave this here with you now. Next episode is going to be about seed germination. So for that, you're going to want to make sure you have a little bit of soil on hand. And most importantly, you want to make sure that you have some sort of seed that you want to grow. We're going to plant lettuce. We're going to talk to you about all the different ways that you can start seeds, from a simple process to something that's more complex. So join us next episode in Hagrid's Garden.